So you want to own a private prison. Guaranteed customers. Guaranteed revenue. A government contract that pays you whether the product shows up or not. That's the pitch behind owning a private prison. No marketing budget, no customer acquisition cost. The state does the recruiting for you, one arrest at a time. Sounds like the cleanest business model in America. It isn't, because the entire industry runs on a number nobody says out loud in the press release, the minimum occupancy guarantee. A clause buried in almost every state contract that requires the facility stay at least 90, sometimes 95% full. Or the state still has to pay as if it were. Empty beds cost you nothing. Empty beds cost the taxpayer everything. And that single clause is the paradox at the center of this entire industry. You are not selling a service. You are selling scarcity of freedom, and your balance sheet only works if that scarcity keeps arriving on schedule. Stay with this one, because underneath the guaranteed cash flow is a business so operationally fragile that two of its largest owners still ended up in bankruptcy court. Tier 1. Bootstrapped and local. A county-level halfway house or a small regional detention contract. Startup capital, $2 to $4 million, mostly financing the building itself, since counties rarely build for you. Annual revenue on a 200-bed facility running near capacity. $6 to $9 million, built entirely on a per diem rate. The daily fee, the government pays you per inmate, per day. Tier 2. Mid-market and regional. This is where the real players sit. A 1,000-bed state contract facility. Capital requirement, $40 to $80 million, financed almost entirely through municipal bonds or private prison-focused REITs. Annual revenue, $30 to $50 million, and now you're negotiating multi-year contracts with occupancy floors written directly into the agreement. Tier 3. Institutional. This is core civic and GEO group territory. Publicly traded operators managing tens of thousands of beds across federal, state, and ICE detention contracts simultaneously. Market capitalization north of $1 billion. Revenue in the billions. At this tier, you're not running a prison. You're running a real estate investment trust that happens to lease cells instead of office space, and Wall Street treats your average daily population the way it treats a hotel's occupancy rate. Here's the mechanic nobody explains at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Think of the entire business like an airline that sells tickets nobody wanted to buy. An airline needs a certain number of seats filled to break even. A private prison needs a certain number of beds filled to break even. The difference is an airline discounts empty seats to fill them. A private prison doesn't discount anything. It lobbies. That's not a metaphor. It's documented industry behavior. Lobbying expenditures, campaign contributions, and support for stricter sentencing policy all correlate directly with occupancy protection. The product is the bed. The customer pipeline is criminal justice policy itself. Two numbers run the entire operation. ADP, average daily population, the metric every operator reports to investors like a same-store sales figure. And cost per inmate day, the number operators are constantly trying to shrink because your revenue is fixed by contract, but your margin lives entirely inside how cheaply you can staff, feed, and medicate each body in the building. Here's the counterintuitive part. The single biggest lever on profitability isn't the prisoners. It's staffing ratio. Public prisons average one correctional officer for roughly every 4 to 5 inmates. Private facilities routinely run leaner, sometimes one officer for every 8, 9, or 10, because payroll is the only major line item the operator actually controls. Squeeze the guard-to-inmate ratio, and margin appears out of thin air. It also disappears out of thin air, because that same ratio is the single biggest predictor of the violence, understaffing lawsuits, and state contract terminations that gut this industry from the inside. Walk the physical design, and it stops looking like architecture and starts looking like an actuarial table. Everything is engineered around minimizing labor costs per square foot. Dormitory-style housing instead of individual cells, because you can supervise 60 inmates with 2 officers in an open bay versus 4 officers walking 60 separate cell doors. Centralized sightlines. Minimal natural light, because windows are expensive and offer nothing toward the occupancy contract. Food service contracted out to the lowest per meal bidder the budget allows, because meals are a cost center with zero revenue upside. The invisible liability sitting underneath all of it is litigation exposure. Every private operator carries a standing reserve, sometimes tens of millions of dollars, for wrongful death, negligence, and civil rights claims, because understaffing at this scale doesn't just save money. It statistically produces incidents. Assaults rise. Suicide watch, failures rise. And every incident becomes a lawsuit that a public prison, protected by broader government immunity, would never have faced in the same way. That reserve doesn't show up on the glossy investor slide about occupancy and margin. It shows up 3 years later as a settlement line item that erases an entire quarter's profit. 2 failures show exactly how this collapses. The first is a capital structure failure. In 2007, a small town in Montana financed a 500-bed private detention facility through $27 million in municipal bonds, betting on federal or state contracts that never materialized. No occupancy guarantee existed because no government agency had signed one. The facility sat empty. The town defaulted on the bonds. The building stood vacant for years, a fully built prison with 0 prisoners, the purest proof that this entire business model is worthless the moment the guaranteed customer disappears. The second is a market mismatch and operational failure. A private youth facility in Mississippi, run under a state juvenile contract, was staffed so thin that federal investigators later described conditions inside as some of the worst in the country for a juvenile facility. Rampant violence, sexual abuse allegations, and a Department of Justice finding of unconstitutional conditions. The state pulled the contract. The operator lost the facility, the reputation, and years of litigation followed. The lesson wasn't that the business model failed to generate revenue. The revenue was fine right up until the day the state decided the operational failure was too visible to keep funding. One died from too much leverage and not enough customers. The other died from too many customers and not enough humanity in how they were housed. Strip away the press releases and the entire model collapses into one equation: guaranteed occupancy times per diem rate minus staffing and litigation reserve equals margin. Realistic net margins across the publicly traded operators run in the 8 to 12% range in good years. Respectable for infrastructure, thin enough that a single major lawsuit or a single lost state contract can wipe out an entire year's profit. The institution that mastered this system wasn't a person. It was Corrections Corporation of America, later rebranded CoreCivic, which spent 4 decades proving that the real product being sold was never rehabilitation, security, or even incarceration itself. It was contractual certainty, the ability to guarantee a government client a fixed cost, a fixed bed count, and a fixed bill, regardless of what happened inside the walls. The system was never built to reward the state, the inmate, or the community. It was built to reward whoever controlled the contract, and it has punished every operator who forgot that the moment occupancy drops, or the moment the world finally looks too closely at how those beds stay full, the entire balance sheet collapses with it.